You wake up tomorrow and you make toast. It takes 10 seconds. You don't think about it at all, but somewhere on the other side of that simple act is a 14,000-year-old mystery, and it is stranger than you think, because bread was not supposed to exist yet. Here is the story most people believe. Humans settled down, humans started farming, and farming gave us bread. Simple. Logical. Also, probably wrong. In 2018, an archaeobotanist named Amaya Arons Otaegui was digging at a site called Shubayqa I, a hunter-gatherer camp in the Black Desert of Jordan. No farms, no fields, just people who moved with the seasons. In the ashes of 2 ancient fireplaces, her team found 24 burnt scraps of food. Under a microscope, those scraps turned out to be flatbread, made from wild wheat, wild barley, and the ground-up roots of a marsh plant. The age of that bread? Roughly 14,400 years old. That's 4,000 years before anyone planted a deliberate crop. So hunter-gatherers, people with no permanent homes, were harvesting wild grass seeds, grinding them into flour, and baking bread. Why would anyone do that? The seeds were tiny, bitter, hard as gravel. You'd break a tooth trying to eat one raw, and that's the part that matters most. Wild grain is basically inedible to a human body. The starch inside is locked away in a structure your gut can't unlock. Eat it raw, and you get almost nothing back for the effort. But crack the husk, grind it into powder, add water, apply heat. Suddenly the starch unfolds and your body can absorb it. Grinding and cooking a grain isn't cooking. It's a chemical hack. It's forcing a locked door open, and humans needed that hack because compared to other apes, our gut is small. We traded intestine length for brain size somewhere back in our evolution. Great deal for eating meat and cooked tubers. Terrible deal for raw plants. Bread was the workaround, a way to squeeze real calories out of a food that nature never designed us to eat. At a site called Ohalo II on the Sea of Galilee, archaeologist Ehud Weiss found a grinding stone coated in starch residue dated to 23,000 years ago, the late Ice Age. Mammoths were still walking around, and someone by that lake was already turning wild grain into flour. And in Italy, at a cave called Grotta Paglicci, researchers found grinding tools with heat-treated oat starch on them, dated to roughly 32,000 years ago. 32,000. Long before agriculture, long before permanent settlements, long before almost everything we associate with civilization. So here's the real question. If bread came before farming, could bread have caused farming? Grinding wild grain by hand is exhausting. Find it. Cut it stalk by stalk, carry it home, crack every husk, grind for hours on a stone. The payoff is small, but the product, that dense, portable, calorie-rich loaf, was worth the labor. Evidence increasingly suggests it wasn't an everyday food at first. It was a feast food, a ritual food. Which brings us to Göbekli Tepe, a massive stone complex in southeastern Turkey, built by hunter-gatherers around 9,500 BC. Before farming existed in the region. Archaeologists have found signs of enormous grain processing there, enough to feed the crowds who gathered for ceremonies. The theory is simple and a little dizzying. The demand for bread and beer at these gatherings may have been the very pressure that pushed people to start deliberately planting seeds, not the other way around. Farming, in other words, might exist because people wanted more bread. Now here's a twist almost nobody expects. At some point in ancient Egypt, someone left dough sitting out too long. Wild yeast in the air settled into it, and instead of throwing it away, they baked it anyway. It puffed up. That's leavened bread, and it was likely an accident that changed everything. The science behind it is elegant. Flour contains 2 proteins, glutenin and gliadin. Mix them with water, and they link into a stretchy web called gluten. Yeast eats the sugar in the dough and releases carbon dioxide. That gas gets trapped inside the gluten, and the dough rises. Bake it, and you lock the structure in place. Soft, airy. Bread as we know it today. By Egypt's New Kingdom, bakers had cataloged nearly 40 types of bread, flavored with dates, honey, and coriander. Bread was so central that it functioned as currency. The workers who built the pyramids at Giza were paid in loaves of bread and jars of beer. And bread and beer were quite literally the same technology. Bakers crumbled loaves into water to start a ferment, and brewers skimmed the yeast foam off beer to leaven bread. 2 industries, 1 shared secret. But bread had a cost, and it was paid mostly by women. Grinding grain on a stone quern for hours a day left a mark on the human skeleton. At the site of Abu Huraira in Syria, researchers found arthritis in the toe joints from kneeling for hours, collapsed vertebrae in the lower spine, and forearm bones as dense as those of modern competitive rowers. Bread fed early civilization. Someone's body absorbed the bill? Rome eventually mechanized the process. At Barbegal in southern France, 16 water wheels once powered a mill capable of producing over 4 tons of flour a day. For the first time, water did the crushing instead of a human spine. And Rome treated bread as raw political power. Free grain distributions began in 123 BC and eventually fed 200,000 citizens a month. The poet Juvenal coined the phrase bread and circuses to describe how emperors kept the population calm. Feed people, and they don't revolt. Stop feeding them, and everything changes. When the volcano buried Pompeii in 79 AD, it froze over 30 commercial bakeries in ash. One bakery for every 350 people, more bread shops per capita than modern Manhattan has today. In one oven, archaeologists found a round loaf, scored into 8 wedges, still sitting exactly where a baker left it 2,000 years ago. And bread reshaped language itself. The English word companion comes from Latin, meaning with bread, someone you share a loaf with. The word lord comes from an Old English term meaning loaf guardian. Lady comes from a word meaning loaf kneader. Every time someone says lord or lady, they are, without realizing it, talking about bread. Bread also toppled governments. In 18th century France, ordinary workers spent up to 88% of their income on bread. When harvests failed and prices spiked in 1788 and 1789, the anger didn't stay quiet. The Women's March on Versailles, one of the sparks of the French Revolution, was driven largely by the price of a loaf. When people can't afford bread, they stop tolerating the people in charge of it. Even writing itself may owe its existence to grain. The earliest known writing system, Sumerian cuneiform, wasn't invented for poetry or law. It was invented to count barley. Clay tokens representing grain quantities were pressed into wet tablets, and those impressions slowly became the world's first written language. Civilization's memory began in a grain ledger. So how did humans invent bread? The honest answer is that they didn't, not once, not in one place. It was invented independently again and again on nearly every continent by people who had never met each other, using whatever starchy plant grew nearby. Wild wheat in Jordan, wild oats in Italy, corn in Mesoamerica, teff in Ethiopia. Different grains, different continents, the same 3 ingredients arriving at the same idea. Grind it, wet it, heat it. Tomorrow you'll eat bread again. Toast, maybe. A sandwich. You won't think about the 14,000 years of trial, labor, and aching bodies that led to it sitting in your hand. You won't think about the woman whose spine bent under the weight of grinding flour, or the hunter-gatherer who first realized a worthless wild seed could keep a family alive through winter. You'll just eat it. And somehow, that might be the most human thing about bread of all. It became so essential, so woven into everything we are, that we forgot it was ever invented at all.